And now we have our final talk, which is going to be Tim Tickle, talking a little bit about the data coordination platform and how to get involved. So a little bit more about how you can get involved in the computational analysis in the here and now.
All right, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. I am learning so much. I'm sure I'll continue to, even through my own presentation. Nonetheless, I'm here to talk a little bit about the data coordination platform. It's a new thing that we have. We've recently made available publicly as we've been building it. And sort of the intent of this is sort of give a feel for what it is and sort of how it works currently. And then, make sure that we start making that the opportunities to be engaged more. So we know the HCA community is quite a large thing doing quite a lot of stuff, right? Doing things that are specifically for HCA and also doing additional things as well to generate your data, as we talked about with disease and translation and so on. And so there can be a lot of different things that as a data coordination platform, people would ask you to do, and so we have to find a focus. And so for at least right now, given the feedback we currently have, our current focus is sort of focusing on that atlas building concept in the HCA, which seems so vital to our mission statement. And so we know that there's lots of people involved with this process. There's people that are really focused on the experimental, assay work and developing it. There are people that are really just focused on the computational side of things, and there are people that are data contributors that are learning from those experimental method developers, and maybe they're doing analysis as well as they're contributing. And so there's quite a diversity of people that have needs around atlas building. And so the hope is that certainly the data creation platform is not here to tell you how to do your analyses and such, and you will be doing your analyses for your publications as makes sense for you. But that extra step afterwards, sort of how do you then take this data that you have, that you've published on and such, and bring it together in a common harmonized data corpus so that you can easily use someone else's data and they can easily use yours, and you can bring it together and make something greater than what you currently started with, this atlas building that we're trying to do all together. Hopefully that's our intention and that's our focus currently, given the current feedback. And so the system is live. I'll have a URL in a couple slides down so you can see where it's at and you can play with it here if you'd like. But the reality is it is live. It recently became live, and it's a baby now. It's got big shoes to grow into. But as you know, with children, it takes a village to grow them. So I'm hoping your voices will be a part of that as we move forward. But I'm here to talk about where we are currently with our newborn. So this is what it looks like, but it doesn't help too much. It kind of looks like Google, right? So search for your thing here, which is good. But I want to talk a little bit about what's the journey of data through the system. It gives you kind of a feel of what exactly is this thing and how does it work currently. And I think that there are certain aspects about it that are a little different from other data centers that at least I'm involved with, and I'll point those out so you're aware of them. Already, in the last presentation, for instance, there are already some really great take-homes from that I'm looking forward to leveraging for growing this, and I'm sure you'll have others as well that we can talk through. So this little, kind of a roadmap is what we'll go through today, talking just a little bit about the life of the data as it comes through the system. And we'll start up at the top for the research data. So the first thing is submission of data. Originally, the intention of the DCP was that this data is not going to be processed in some centralized data center somewhere. The reality is because everyone knows their tissue, right? And they know their biology. And so they're going to be the best people to handle that tissue and biology and to sequence it at their site to be able to move forward this atlas building. And so for research data, for the research data submission, we don't run the sequencing ourselves. We don't receive samples and such. We assume that is being processed at some location and that is federated, and anyone can submit data to the system for the HCA atlas. And so, for instance, for those a little closer to the metal, like a FASTQ file that's unfiltered, we'd expect after sequencing. So in the process of submitting data, we actually have data wranglers. So these are people that will work with you to make sure you can get through the onboarding and barrier of submitting data. In that process, there's a couple things that happen. Number one, we have a standard metadata schema that we validate against. So our metadata team works hard on trying to make sure that we have modeled metadata before the data comes into the system, describing that data. But there's not too hard of a barrier of entry of required metadata for that. So it's a balance you have to play in. that it requires talking to a lot of people and making sure that you're aware of what's needed specifically for their biology as you're collecting those things. And so I'm happy to say that we actually have a member of our metadata team here today. If you have any questions, Zena, you can raise your hand, which shows you how actively they're interested in engaging community. She's here. But nonetheless, when the data is entered into the system, there are checks that happen, making sure that the metadata itself is validated against the schema, and also checking the data, making sure it's not empty or corrupt and such. To step back for a moment, this whole system is automated as best we can. It's automated, and we have operators that make sure if anything happens, they keep going. And it is all cloud-based. So, for instance, that feedback in the last presentation, talking about like how cloud-based resources may not be, helpful in some situations. I'm really interested in hearing about that. But nonetheless, this is cloud-based technology where after the actual submission happens, the data is stored for free in AWS and Google Cloud Platform. So, in case one person is using one as opposed to the other system, you should be able to access it. Now, at this point, if we don't have a data pipeline for it quite yet, that raw data is immediately available. If we do have a pipeline available for it, then it's triggered and automatically begins to process that data. So just a little moment to talk about the analysis pipelines themselves. You can imagine there's a lot of things people want to do in their analyses. And many times it's very specific to your actual publication. It's not very standardized amongst the whole community. What we try to do in these standard pipelines is make sure that the things that people can agree on that can support your analysis and your work are done automatically and free for you. So you don't have to worry about that piece. So when thinking about, for instance, single-cell transcriptomics, from the FASTQ file to processing, aligning it, getting QC metrics and such, and giving you a matrix, so like expression, for instance, or counts, that's done for you. Then after that, you can take that, download it, and do whatever you want to do moving forward. And as a scientific community, when you agree on next steps and standards and stuff, we'll bring that into the system. We just understand that there's a lot of innovation in our world, and we want to make sure that that is normalizes and is agreed upon before we force you to do anything. These pipelines are containerized. It's a great thing to do. And I'll talk a little bit about how they're portable as well. So you don't have to use the system to use those pipelines if you have other kinds of data. So after the data is analyzed, it goes back into storage. Once again, that's now then immediately publicly available. And there's different things that might be attached to that publicly available space. Some of the things are ours, some of the things are not ours. One thing, for instance, is the data browser, which you saw a little bit of piece of, and I'll show you a screenshot in a couple of slides. The data browser is for you to be able to simply file browse, see the data, and be able to access it and download it. Now, you can do that as a user through a GUI or interface, or you can do that as a programmer as well. So as far as programmers go, for those out there, we have like libraries that will help you download the data as well. And those are more helpful, I think, whenever you're thinking about downloading like raw data or BAMs and stuff like that kind of thing. But they're available for all the data. So I'm skipping over matrix service for a moment because I want to show you a little bit about that. It's an interesting concept for us. But also as well, note that there's the ability for analysis portals to be attached to the system as well. And so this means that third parties can show their science off, their capabilities off, and do any specific kinds of analyses they'd like to do with this data. So if you have these kinds of aspirations, we are beginning to get in the process of creating APIs which you can actually attach and stuff and do those kinds of things. So this is a picture of the data browser, and that's the URL at the top. As far as the data browser goes, you have multifaceted search, so that you can go through and search on different kinds of things that we think you might be interested in, like the donor, the tissue type, the method of actual sequencing, for instance, like the library. Once you have all the data that you're interested in, directly you can get access to the different metadata and matrices that are for each of the different runs for the studies, for instance. And that can look like a couple things depending upon what you're interested in getting. One thing that I think is really cool about this system is what we call the matrix service, which I skipped over a moment ago. And when you take a couple studies, for instance, you have 5 studies and you want to get the matrices for them, you can go in the download, for the downloads they're exporting, you can go and get an expression matrix. And what will happen is the service itself will concatenate all your matrices together for you. And then give it to you in a file format that makes hopefully sense for you. There's a couple file formats we have, and we've tested them to make sure they work in de facto environments like R and Python, for instance, to try to support computational biologists in that space. There are other ways to export data as well, getting a manifest of the data, for instance, and downloading programmatically. And then there are some other portals, for instance, that you can attach to that allow you to do other kinds of analyses and work with the data outside the system as well if you want more control, since this is a more automated system. And so this is an example, for instance, of how you could, if you're a programmer, grab programmatically those files as well from the matrix service. We're trying to make sure it's made available to developers and computational biologists for that space. So that's a little bit of a trip through the system itself. There's certain aspects of this system I think that are pretty unique to it. Number one, the federated data submission. The human data wranglers, not specifically unique, but also very valuable. We require metadata modeling from the very beginning to put the data into the system. And then certainly free compute and storage, and then the matrix service itself that makes it easier to use some of these outputs, really the vital outputs that a lot of people are interested in, which is these matrices. But how can you get involved with this, for instance? Well, certainly the intention and the hope is that everyone here can submit data to the system, that you can do your own sequencing and you can submit the data yourself. And so if that's not the case, we want to hear about that. So as far as the process of submitting data, you would email this team right here, the Wrangler team, and they would start walking you through the process of submission and such. Also as well, for this data to be in the system, and the metadata has to be modeled. And so reaching out to people like Zena and our metadata team on making sure the metadata holds enough richness that you can move forward with your specific biology and your specific study is very important to us. And so engaging and being involved on what kind of metadata we have and does it fit your biology and your needs. Pipelines. So our pipelines are open source. They're open source, they're openly licensed, they're Dockerized, and they're available in a couple of places for different kinds of people. So firstly, for the developer, they're in GitHub for you. We develop in a completely open environment. In fact, actually, all the code for the full system is in GitHub, and it is openly licensed and visible to anyone. Although developers are one of our users that want to work with these kinds of systems, other people, for instance, computational biologists, might be more comfortable in using DocStore, for instance. And so all the pipelines, when they're released here, like at major releases, they're put into DocStore as well. So if you're a computational biologist, use DocStore, that's available. And so in a lot of ways, we're trying to leverage GH4GH standards. The pipelines themselves are written in the GH4GH standard language. They're using GH4GH standard outputs as they exist. And then lastly, there are other portals attached to the system. One of them is called Terra, for instance. Full disclosure, I work with a Broad, and this is a Broad product. But I do think it's actually a very useful thing for the conversations I've had with this group. And it's an environment where the pipelines also exist, and you can run the pipelines yourselves on other data, or actually modify the pipelines and run those modifications and such. Or run other pipelines on HCA data. So hopefully that enables people to do other kinds of things beyond the standard analysis. Another thing that is very important to us is getting feedback. We have a pretty active testing group that we work with groups of scientists, going through the system itself, seeing if they can do things, that we have the documentation that's enough for them to do what they need to do on the system. The first figure that I showed you, only one of the tabs is actually what we're talking about. Several other tabs are full of guides and documentations and description of the pipelines that we assume are useful. But we really need your voice in this group of people. I want to know that you can use the system. I want to know that you can download the matrices you need to download. Like, if there's an issue there, we need to be able to work with you to find out what is needed. So please email this group, email me, talk to us, but have your voice represented in our feedback. Otherwise, we won't hear it. And also analysis portals. Attaching an analysis portal, you could either, number one, just list your tools and your methodology analyses that could leverage HCA on the actual site itself. This is a very easy process to do, and it is not curated. It just requires you to fill out the information and then it is brought up online. It is unbiased. But if you feel like you have a portal that could leverage the data and do things with it, please reach out so that we can talk through how to actually attach things as we're developing that capacity. And so this is a big thank you from the team, and would love to hear about how we can do this better.
Any questions for Tim?
Hi Tim, it's Audrey Duncanson from the Wellcome Trust. I just wanted to say it's great that we've managed to slip the HV Africa logo onto all your slides. You've been co-opted into the project.
Hey!
Great. In terms of the data that's currently in the DCP, how much of it can you tell is from lower resource sort of countries, and can you see from your stats how many people from those lower resource environments are actually accessing the data and using it?
So yeah, I don't actually know how many people are accessing it geographically. It's a good question. But as far as the data itself, certainly you can look right now, but you can imagine the HCA. So we are leveraging data that's submitted to the system under the criteria that the scientific committee, our scientific community in general asks for. And so honestly, this community here exists because we need more diversity in that space, right?
Tim, that talk, thank you so much, and huge effort. So if HCA is really serious about setting equity goals, what stats should be on the data composition and donor composition at the front page of your portal, and what stats and user groups should be available so that we as a community know that there's some effort to meet those equity goals?
Yeah, actually, I would turn that around. I don't want to define those metrics. I think it'd be more important for you to define those metrics and help us show you where we're at and report correctly to you and have those available. So.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Ali from Abu Dhabi. Great presentation. My question is, jurisdictions that have restrictions in terms of, sending their data to the cloud, if they have their own data center, is there a way for that data within certain jurisdictions to benefit from this platform, or does it physically need to be exported to the outside their borders?
Right. So this is the V1 of the system, and it was always intended that it was supporting openly consented data. And my personal perspective in looking into the HCA is that data consent is actually really, really complicated. And so we're thinking of, there are groups of lawyers thinking about how they can actually do this correctly. And we're working with them to try to, in our roadmap, enable more and more types of data. So as far as this goes, for instance, we have the ability to mirror storage. So if there was, for instance, a country that required a different kind of cloud environment because it can't go out of their country or whatever it might be for that, there's technically not a barrier here for that, but we have to understand what that is. I think it's actually a hugely complicated thing. And so be a part of that conversation to define it and make it happen. So.
I think the continuation is like, if, to address the equity would be, how do we ensure that, different scientists or expertise are able to offer their expertise, outside, let's say, the US or areas where there are experts? Because I think a scientist who, let's say, is sitting in Boston, if his institution is not acknowledging their work or their analytical capability outside, they are disincentivized. So how to leverage, the expertise at the scientific level, or at, other solutions like experts being able to do sabbatical, or because this way I think we will have broader subscription and maybe the penetration of this or will be higher. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think as well, like as efforts like this equity meeting, ramp up and come into play, there will be more, data from other spaces in the world, and because of that, there'll be more pressure to try to understand and resolve these things as well. So As a side note, for data that's in the system, in talking about being acknowledged for your data, it is locally licensed, but licensed in the way where the data submitters have to be attributed. So hopefully that can be a leverage and a way of making yourself acknowledged.
Thanks, Tim. That was great. So if I understand, so from the portal, I can download BEM file or FASTQ file.
Yes. Well, so that's a huge file. You don't want to do it over the browser. You can get the actual command to do it. Yes.
So if I can actually download, do I need a restriction, a permission from you or from the people who actually submitted to reanalyze this data?
So so as far as downloading it or whatever that might be, currently in the system right now, we are working with openly consented data, right? So once you hit the system, it's available to everyone. As far as use of the data, it's licensed with a Creative Commons license, I think BY2 or something. But what it means is that you have to acknowledge the people who generate the data, but you can do what you want to do with the data.
Tim, two questions. One is, how can you find your slides online? Because I'd love to send the link to various people. It was very useful.
My slides can be given to any one of us.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
Yep.
And second, quick questions. So the data portals, can anyone put up a data portal? How equitable is that?
Yeah. So there's a couple ways of thinking about this. Firstly, there's different kinds of various portals. One portal would be you have an actual portal that you want to interact with the data and do things with, for instance. And so we are developing right now the capacity to do that. We have a couple examples of how to do that, and we're continuing to grow that. So if you have something you think could be a part of that, let us know. Another thing is what you saw, I believe what Muzz showed was you also may have like websites and such resources that you develop yourself about your data. Right, and we saw that. And so that can be added in with the metadata and leveraged in the portal itself as well. Those are two different things, but hopefully we'll be able to support both of them well.
Thank you.
So Tim, it's all uploading the data onto the cloud and then analyzing it within the cloud. That model works very well. I want to make a suggestion because oftentimes, in countries such as India and other such places, when you're uploading data and the data set is large, very often we snap.
Yeah.
And so, some softwares will allow you to restart from where it snapped, and in others you have to start all over again. And if you start all over again, we don't know whether we are going to be able to upload all of the data. So as you build in these kinds of things, make sure that, I know it's not easy to write these programs, but make sure that we can, upload it where it snapped. Otherwise, it becomes an impossible task to upload all of the data.
Yeah, no, that's great feedback. And also, I want to just really strongly reiterate the part about the feedback. Like, we want to make sure people who would experience that are experiencing that in our process, so we know to be resilient to that. We want you to submit your data so that we can see that there might be this issue, so that we can address it.
So this is not, I'm not making it up, because we constantly upload data on the ICBC portal, and this happens, and the ICBC portal does not have the capability of restarting data upload from where it snapped.
Yeah, I believe you. Oh, we had a blackout recently.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. There was a question that came up now that also came up in the previous smaller meeting we had, and so I wanted to reiterate it because I think it's an interesting one as a common theme, which was how many current low and middle income country scientists are participating with this right now and submitting the data. We've heard that there is capacity in multiple sites now. Somebody's sitting in front of me, somebody's sitting behind me. And it reminds me of when I was doing my postdoc, And the Broad had an amazing software called Gene Pattern for microarray analysis, and it's just phenomenal. It made it so easy to do all the analyses and everything. But the first few times I tried to use it, I ran into all these kind of difficulties, and nobody in my lab or in the regions knew how to do it. So I just went across the street to the Broad and got a few questions answered. And then I spent a couple weeks at the Broad working with people that were, writing and developing Gene Pattern, learned what I need to learn. And then I went back and was able to use it for years successfully as, the software that I did my data analysis with. So, I recognize that if I were sitting in a different country and the Broad hadn't been just across the street, maybe I never would have been able to leverage that or take advantage of that software platform. So I wonder here, is there a role for, I think somebody mentioned it, whether it's sabbatical, whether it's a short exchange, would HCA be interested in sponsoring, people to come who are interested for a couple of weeks and sitting down with them to get them up and running? Is that something that's been considered, or is it a structure that seems interesting?
Yes, it's a structure that seems interesting, and it's something that we were discussing with CZI and Jonah Kula, who unfortunately couldn't come. But we're looking to pilot some small exchanges and just see what works. We're not 100% sure, but we know that doing a couple of small things to see where we get the most bang for our buck is the right thing to do at this point, and I can imagine several of them around data coordination. We're gonna wrap up after one more question, because we're gonna do a final discussion.
Just one last comment riffing off of that. I would also suggest that you go to Nikki's place in Cape Town or one of the other places, so you can see firsthand what the challenges are in country, what they're dealing with, instead of waiting for them to come to you. I think it would go both ways very well.
Yeah, that makes sense.